Hello again. This episode, let's talk about Lord Dunsany's beautiful work, The Gods of Pegana. As always, apologies for the inevitable mispronunciations. For those who are unfamiliar, The Gods of Pegana is a collection of vignettes about the titular deities of a fantasy world called Pegana. While this sounds mundane today, it was the first of its kind when Lord Dunsany got it published back in 1905. It is no exaggeration to say that this book was a huge influence on the genre as a whole, along with the works of numerous other authors. Lovecraft and Tolkien both were influenced by this, essentially acting as the foundation of the fantasy genre and its elaborate other worlds and fantastical pantheons. The book provides brief touches on the key figures of the pantheon, from the sleeping creator Mecha-Author to Skarl the drummer to the myriad of deities whose roles cover the strange and small things of the world. Examples of which you'll find in the passage I'm about to quote. These be the gods of the hearth, Pisu, who stroked the cat, Hobit who calms the dog, and Abanya, the lord of glowing embers, and little Zumbabu, the lord of dust, and old Gribon, who sits in the heart of the fire to turn the wood to ash. All these be home gods, and live not in Pegana and be lesser than Rune. End quote. As one can probably guess at this point, Dunsany invented the modern concept of world building by writing The Gods of Pegana. Though I should point out that for readers today, one's used to elaborate worlds with far more detail than Dunsany ever put into his work, it can seem a little sparse. The vignettes are short, even by short story standards, and sometimes they can feel more like concepts and broad strokes of a greater, more detailed story. They don't always feel like there's enough meat there to have fully explored the narrative threads that were written. But I'd argue that this weakness is a minor one, and that focusing on it is a mistake. Apart from the impact The Gods of Pegana had in essentially creating the entire fantasy genre, it is also worth reading for the beauty of the prose more than any sort of narrative. There are just instances where Dunsany's words are strung together in a manner that is almost like poetry, with a rhythm that carries things forward if you're the sort of reader that appreciates that. You don't often see that sort of rhythmic prose very often, except in people who are trying to evoke that particular style. Or took their stylistic cues from the Bible. There's creative world building to be had there too, though it can be hard to appreciate because later authors have done it and taken it to places Dunsany didn't. The concept of small gods originated in this book, though it is more often associated with Discworld and Terry Pratchett, for example. The book is a triumph of beautiful prose and evoking enchantment and wonder in the creation of a fantasy world, in ways that most modern short stories or even novels don't. There's no plot to tie the world to, so Pegana can breathe and stretch itself out in whatever direction feels appropriate, and always there's something interesting in that direction. Once again, I just want to gush about the writing approach Dunsany took. There is a beauty inherent to it that gives itself a sense of dignity and evocative power, even when it isn't even trying to weave a narrative together. The book is a joy to read for that reason alone, provided you're the sort of person who appreciates that kind of thing. I personally am, though I can understand why there are those who can't wrap their heads around it. The wonder of the world of Pegana is just there, waiting to be explored through Dunsany's prose, as if the reader is exploring the world and its circumstances before Mecha-Author awakens and brings about the end of almost all things. Skarl the drummer survives, for some reason. Overall, I think The Gods of Pegana is worth a read if you can see it through the lens of reading a mythology, rather than a story. The myths, from Greek to Roman to Norse to Japanese, and all others? They don't have a coherent narrative most of the time. There might be a stated climactic event, such as Ragnarok, but it isn't something that the myths usually build towards. That is something we ascribe to them, but mythologies on their own don't have that. The Gods of Pegana is a mythology in that sense. They're stories and myths that exist for their own sake. That, for me, is the key takeaway from this. That sometimes a world just has to exist for itself, rather than any particular goal or narrative. Done right, this can make a world feel lived in and alive, more so than the overly detailed methodology that permeates fantasy post-Tolkien. Just stories and ideas being pieced together into a complicated, sometimes internally inconsistent, whole. Sometimes a world doesn't have to exist just to serve some grand overarching narrative, it just has to be and to exist for its own sake. Not every fantasy or science fiction setting has to be built around a central conflict or detailed down to what color shoes are most popular in any given part of that world. They don't need to be built around a central narrative that the author wants to tell or to justify a ridiculous magic system that's detailed and predictable enough that it might as well be a science rather than magic. All you need is the ability to evoke a sense of awe and wonder, all else can be secondary. That's my take on it, anyway. With that, I leave another quote from the book itself as this episode's parting words. But ere the day comes back to her own again, and all the conquering armies of the dawn hurl their red lances in the face of the night, Yoharnathlahai leaves the sleeping worlds, and rows back up the river of silence, that flows from Pegana into the sea of silence that lies beyond the worlds.